I grew up hearing about the British and the French carving up Africa, the Belgian atrocities in the Congo, and the Portuguese clinging to their last colonies. But what about Germany? It's like history hit the mute button on their time in Africa. And yet, from the late 19th to early 20th century, Germany had its hands deep in the colonial game. Brutal, ambitious, and largely forgotten. Let's talk about it. In the late 1800s, Germany was late to the colonial party. While Britain and France had been looting the continent for centuries, Germany only unified as a country in 1871. But Kaiser Wilhelm II and his predecessors were eager to catch up, and catch up they did, with brute force. By the early 1900s, Germany controlled for major territories in Africa: German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi; German South West Africa, modern-day Namibia; Togoland, Togo, and part of Ghana; and Cameroon. This wasn't some polite trading arrangement. This was violent conquest, forced labor, and racial oppression on a mass scale. If you think Germany's atrocities started with World War II, think again. One of the first genocides of the 20th century happened in German Southwest Africa. In 1904, the Herero and Nama people rebelled against German rule, fed up with land theft, exploitation, and brutal conditions. Germany's response: complete annihilation. This dark chapter began in 1884, when the Berlin Conference officially kicked off the scramble for Africa. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, initially reluctant to join the colonial race, changed his tune once he realized the political capital to be gained. The newly unified German state needed to flex its muscles on the world stage. Colonies weren't just economic assets. They were symbols of national prestige. German merchants had already established footholds along African coastlines. Before official colonization began, firms like Warham and Line in the German East Africa Company conducted trade. But they wanted more. They wanted government backing for territorial expansion, and the government, hungry for raw materials and new markets for German industrial goods, was happy to oblige. The colonial acquisition process was brutally simple. Send in explorers, have them sign dubious protection treaties with local chiefs who often had no idea what they were signing away. Then move in troops to secure the territory. German explorer Gustav Nachtigall traveled to West African coast, doing exactly this, acquiring Togoland and Cameroon through treaties that local leaders would later regret signing. Karl Peters, founder of the German East Africa Company, was even more ruthless. Known as Bloody Hand Peters by Africans, he secured treaties at gunpoint across what would become German East Africa. His methods were so barbaric that even the German government eventually recalled him. Not because they objected to his violence, but because his excesses were becoming politically embarrassing. Unlike Britain's indirect rule system, Germany preferred direct control. They didn't just want resources, they wanted to remake Africa in a German image. This cultural mission meant eradicating traditional governance systems and imposing German laws, language, and customs. Schools taught German, administration was conducted in German, and even African names were replaced with German ones in official records. The infamous wealth politic known as world policy of Kaiser Wilhelm II had transformed Germany's colonial approach from mere commercial interest to aggressive expansion. The Kaiser envied Britain's global empire and saw Africa as Germany's chance to become a well-matched world power. Colonial Governor Hermann von Wissmann expressed the sentiment bluntly: only he who is strong has right on his side. German racial theories played a central role in colonial policy. The Prussian scientist Eugen Fischer conducted horrific racial science experiments in German Southwest Africa, studying mixed-race populations and developing theories that would later influence Nazi racial ideology. Fischer's work in the colonies directly connected to the Holocaust through line of German racial thinking from Africa to Europe. The German colonial machine was ruthlessly efficient. Engineers built railways cutting through African territories at breakneck speed. The Central Line in East Africa, the Northern Railway in Southwest Africa, all constructed with forced African labor. Thousands died building these railways, viewed as necessary sacrifices for German progress. Agricultural policy was equally exploitative. In East Africa, the Germans introduced cash crops like cotton and coffee, forcing Africans to abandon subsistence farming. German settlers received the best land while indigenous peoples were pushed to less fertile areas. The infamous Hut tax ensured Africans had to work for Germans to earn money to pay these taxes. A thinly veiled form of forced labor, administrative boundaries drawn by German colonizers ignored existing ethnic territories. lumping together groups with historical tensions or dividing cohesive communities. These artificial boundaries created conflicts that persist today, particularly in regions like Rwanda and Burundi, where German colonial policies exacerbated Hutu-Tutsi divisions. German colonizers brought Christianity along with their guns. Lutheran and Catholic missionaries established schools and hospitals, seemingly benevolent institutions that simultaneously worked to dismantle traditional African belief systems and social structures. While some missionaries genuinely sought to help Africans, many served as cultural advance guards for colonial control. Women in German colonies faced particular hardship. German colonial law forbade marriages between German men and African women, though sexual exploitation remained rampant. Children born of these unions faced discrimination from both communities. Meanwhile, African women were required to grow crops to feed German garrisons, while still maintaining their traditional family responsibilities. The German colonial mindset was perhaps best captured in Heinrich von Treitschke's infamous proclamation, "Nations which cannot colonize are destined to decay." This philosophy justified any means necessary to establish and maintain colonial control. When rebellions erupted, as they inevitably did, the response was calculated terror designed not just to crush resistance but to prevent anyone from considering it again. By 1908, up to 80% of the Herero population and 50% of the Nama people had been wiped out. This was a blueprint for later atrocities: concentration camps, racial extermination policies, and the dehumanization of entire people. In 1905, when the Maji Maji Rebellion broke out, Germany's response was another massacre. Over 250,000 people were killed, many through starvation as German forces destroyed crops and food supplies to crush resistance. The architect of this genocide was General Lothar von Trotha, who issued the infamous Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot, he declared. What followed was systematic slaughter that shocked even some German officials. Those who surrendered weren't spared. They were sent to concentration camps like Shark Island, where prisoners were worked to death, subjected to medical experiments, and starved. Women and children weren't exempt. German soldiers were given explicit orders to shoot women and children attempting to flee. Survivors described German soldiers laughing as they bayoneted infants and raped women before killing them. Missionary reports documented pregnant women being shot in the back as they ran. This wasn't the fog of war. This was calculated extermination. The camps established in Namibia served as prototypes for what would later emerge in Nazi Germany. At Shark Island, prisoners were numbered, their heads were shaved, and they performed slave labor until death. Medical experiments conducted on prisoners included injecting them with diseases to study the effects. When prisoners died, women were forced to clean the flesh off their skulls using broken glass. These skulls were then sent to German universities for racial research. German scientist Eugene Fischer used Herero and Nama prisoners for his studies on racial superiority. His book on his findings influenced Hitler's Mein Kampf and informed Nazi eugenics programs. The connection is direct. The same pseudoscientific racism that justified the Namibian genocide later fueled the Holocaust. Paul Rohrbach, another influential German colonial theorist, bluntly stated that the death of primitive peoples was necessary for progress when they stood in the way of superior cultures. The aftermath of the genocide was equally disturbing. Land belonging to the Herero and Nama was confiscated and redistributed to German settlers. Survivors were banned from owning land or cattle, essentially destroying their way of life. Many were forced to wear metal identification tags around their necks, marking them as colonial subjects with no rights. These policies created a state of perpetual poverty that persists in parts of Namibia today. In German East Africa, the Maji Maji Rebellion revealed similar brutality. When local populations revolted against German rule, Governor Gustav Adolf von Gitzen implemented a scorched earth policy. "Only hunger and want can bring about a final submission," he wrote. German troops systematically destroyed villages, crops, and food stores across huge swaths of territory. The deliberate starvation that followed killed far more people than actual combat. The rebellion began when spiritual leader Kinjekitile Ngwale united various ethnic groups with a ritual water that he claimed would turn German bullets into water. When this spiritual protection failed, the Germans unleashed brutal reprisals. Entire communities were decimated. In some areas, the population declined by 2/3. Survivors were conscripted into forced labor battalions as punishment for their rebellion. Colonial administrators kept meticulous records of their atrocities, District Officer Franz Mirko wrote about hanging rebels in rows of 40 at a time as a public spectacle. Captain Wangenheim proudly reported executing every male over the age of 10 in rebellious villages. These weren't rogue officers. This was official policy, sanctioned at the highest levels. In Cameroon, the rubber trade produced horrors reminiscent of the Belgian Congo. Companies like the South Cameroon Company were granted concessions to extract rubber using any means necessary. Villages that failed to meet rubber quotas faced collective punishment. German records document punitive expeditions where soldiers would burn villages, take women hostage, and publicly torture community leaders until rubber quotas were met. German administration in Togoland created a system of contracted labor that was slavery in all but name. Workers were captured in raids, chained together, and marched to plantations. Those who collapsed from exhaustion during these marches were shot. On plantations, workers faced daily whippings, starvation rations, and sexual abuse. German plantation owners kept private prisons where workers who didn't meet quotas would be tortured. The German colonial judicial system was designed to legitimize these abuses. Corporal punishment was formally integrated into the legal system, with officials authorized to administer up to 25 lashes for minor infractions. African testimony was inadmissible in court against Europeans. Colonial courts routinely sentenced Africans to chain gangs for crimes like disrespect to Germans or failing to remove their hats in the presence of officials. German scientific expeditions throughout their colonies combined research with exploitation. The Hamburg South Sea Expedition and the Rutens Trotsch Jost. Museum expeditions collected not just artifacts but human remains. Bodies were exhumed from graves without permission. People were photographed against their will for racial archives. And communities were coerced into participating in studies that violated their cultural practices. Medical experimentation wasn't limited to concentration camps. Dr. Robert Koch, who would win a Nobel Prize for his work on tuberculosis, used forced subjects in German East Africa to test experimental treatments for sleeping sickness. Many died from the toxic drugs. When African communities tried to hide their sick to protect them from these experiments, German troops conducted raids to find test subjects. Missions and churches often facilitated colonial control. While some missionaries documented atrocities, others helped implement policies of cultural destruction. In mission schools, African children were punished for speaking their native languages, forced to adopt German names, and taught that their traditional beliefs were primitive superstition. These schools created a small class of African intermediaries who could serve the colonial administration, but were still treated as racially inferior. The environmental impact of German colonialism was equally devastating. In Namibia, wildlife was systematically slaughtered to deny food to Herero refugees hiding in the bush. German forestry policies in East Africa restricted traditional land use, criminalized indigenous hunting, and appropriated community forests for commercial logging. Colonial irrigation projects diverted water from African farms to German plantations, creating artificial droughts in indigenous communities. When World War I broke out, African soldiers were forcibly conscripted into the Schutztruppe. German East Africa's Governor Heinrich Schnee, along with military commander Paul von Lettow-Beck, conscripted over 15,000 Africans as soldiers, and more than 45,000 as porters. The casualties were staggering. By some estimates, 1 million Africans died in East Africa during the war, many from disease and starvation in military labor battalions. Germany's colonial empire didn't last long. When World War I broke out, British, French, and Belgian forces invaded German-held territories in Africa. By 1918, Germany had lost everything. The Treaty of Versailles officially stripped Germany of its colonies, handing them over to other European powers. Because, colonialism was fine as long as the right empires were doing it. But let's not mistake Germany's defeat for justice. The damage was already done, and the scars of German colonial rule still linger. From 1884 to 1918, Germany ruled over vast territories in Africa, including present-day Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo. Like other European empires, Germany saw Africa as a land to be exploited, its people as laborers, and its resources as spoils for the taking. And the results were devastating. But it wasn't just about military campaigns. German colonial rule introduced racial segregation policies that laid the groundwork for future apartheid systems. Forced labor, land seizures, and systematic oppression that became standard practice. Here's the shocking part. Germany has largely erased its colonial past from national memory. Unlike its reckoning with the Holocaust, its African atrocities remain a footnote. While post-war Germany has done extensive work in acknowledging and atoning for Nazi crimes, its colonial history has been largely ignored. German colonial figures are still honored in some places, and street names that commemorate colonial rulers have only recently started being changed. Only recently has Germany begun acknowledging its crimes. In 2021, the German government officially recognized the Herero and Nama genocide and agreed to pay Namibia over $1 billion in development aid as a form of reparation. Many descendants of the victims argue that true justice would mean direct compensation and land restitution, not just aid money handed to the Namibian government. Some critics also point out that while Germany has made gestures of apology, it still hesitates to fully engage in deep conversations about the long-term impacts of its colonialism. History's silence doesn't mean innocence. Germany's role in colonizing Africa deserves just as much scrutiny as any other empires, because forgetting is the first step toward repeating history. So, next time someone talks about European colonialism in Africa and only mentions the British, the Portuguese, or the French, remind them that Germany wasn't just there, it was brutal. And it's time we start talking about it. At Epiven, we uncover the hidden histories that shaped our world. If you want more stories that challenge the narratives we take for granted, make sure to subscribe and stay curious.